Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Security Noise, Hacker Culture, the Self-Modifying Code. I'm Jeff Walton. I run our AppSec practice at TrustedSec. I've got a few people with me today that should make this show fun. Our producer, Skyler Tutor, is here, of course, to make the show sound great. We have our VP of Consulting, Martin Voss, and Mike Felch, a consultant here at TrustedSec, who has done a lot of speaking and stuff in this area, so we're looking forward to his thoughts especially. Today, a couple of information security in case you missed it items, at least one anyway. Microsoft has changed Windows Hello so that it will no longer work in the dark. I guess there were some vulnerabilities with the Face ID logic around the infrared. I'm not really clear on exactly what they're fixing, but interestingly, if you don't have a real webcam, but do have the Face ID hardware, and you disable the webcam in Device Manager, it will still let you authenticate in the dark. So I don't know if that could be something that some folks need to be looking into with group policy and things like that to make sure that those machines have that hardware and that it's enabled if you are using Face ID for Hello in your environment. And of course, TrustedSec is on Discord. You can talk about the show. Go to discord.gg/TrustedSec if you'd like to participate in the online conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and let Martin introduce himself a little bit, talk about his history and how he got into the hacking scene, and we'll give Mike the same opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. So, again, my name is Martin Voss. I'm the Chief Security Officer here at TrustedSec. I would say I got into the hacking culture very, very early on. Not of course, knowing what it was exactly, but going through the motions. I can remember as a child constantly taking things apart and trying to put them back together. Probably my earliest memory is I got the Star Wars Death Star for Christmas, one year. Can't remember, what year it was. And then at the same time, I had some G.I. Joe characters, and I just remember, even intermingling the two, series of toys to put them together and make a display that, wasn't really how they intended it in the very beginning. And so I went through a lot of phases like that. I went through a remote control car phase where I did a lot of modding. I went through a race car phase early on in my life where I did probably some of the most extensive making things work in the way that they don't not necessarily supposed to. I originally got into computers because my dad, although he was very frugal and not necessarily very tech oriented, he came home with a computer very, very early on in my life. It was an Atari 800 XL home computer, and he hooked us up to, for me, was the first internet. I'm sure there was something around before then, but we had a service called CompuServe back then. And there weren't any pictures. Everything was basically terminal based. And really all I did back then was play a lot of role-playing games. That was really all there was to do. But there was always a lot of cool hacks and stuff in the game where you could do things that you weren't supposed to. Back then, all of the code was just flat files, basically, and you could modify things. And I think that's where I really, really got the itch for computers was really back then. And that's, around when the movie Hackers came out. Sadly, I saw it very, very early on. I'm pretty old. So I was able to see that movie very early on when it came out. And I immediately connected with the folks in there. I was also a skateboarder. I had blue hair, tattoos early on. And so I was already part of the sort of outside sort of subculture, that there already was. And so, once I saw that movie Hackers and it kind of put the music and the dressing crazy and the subculture, all together with computers, I really just fell in love with that.
It's really interesting to hear because, I have kind of a lot of the same experience. When I was a kid, we had a TI-99, which was very obsolete at the time, that I had to play with, and later a AT with, ROM basic and a basic manual. And, back in those days, you didn't have, the internet to go look stuff up. So you did have to kind of figure it out. And kind of like you, I had, keeping with a steady stream of hand-me-down computer hardware that he had access to that, allowed me to, learn a lot and start to dig into this stuff. So I should note for everybody that, Martin does actually still have hair despite getting started on an Atari. It is no longer blue. I believe he's having a power failure right now, which is why he's sitting in the dark.
Yeah.
Martin, did you have
Unfortunately,
something else you wanted to add, or should we go on to Mike?
no, go on to Mike. The contractors in my neighborhood did not respect my schedule, so I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is it's interesting that you talk like this because a lot of what you said, is really kind of the roots of where I came from as well. Actually, I joked about it a lot internally with Martin because I think growing up, Martin would have been the guy that I'd been hanging out with had we not lived closer. Because everything from skateboarding to the early days is really kind of where I got my roots. My dad was he was a firmware engineer. He's still a firmware engineer, but he used to spend a lot of time on just Ataris, PCs, Commodore 64s, kind of in the 80s, and bringing them home. And he worked in these environments that, like Bell Labs and some of the crazy tech companies in the early days. So he always had the latest and greatest technology, and he'd bring it home. And so I remember like Atari and the basic cartridges, but then him busting out like the assembler, a cartridge where you could kind of open it up in an assembler and start editing. And so our kitchen table was like full of old school hardware. And then at the same time, so he was a game cracker. So he spent a lot of time like reverse engineering games and trying to issue patches and doing all that stuff. And so I kind of grew up in a household where that's what was going on. He'd go to Blockbuster, rent video games, and try to like reverse engineer them and dump EPROMs and whatnot. So it was kind of cool having that exposure early on because I always had whatever the latest was. And so I kind of grew up in that environment. I think I really got my start though. So I remember CompuServe. Actually, I think it was Prodigy before CompuServe, or I think it was Prodigy CompuServe. But I don't remember. I remember doing CompuServe as well. But I also did the BBS scene. So I was really heavy in the BBSs real early on. That's kind of where I got my start in getting exposed to hacking. And we didn't have images. We only had e-zines or text files that were just kind of pushed NFO files where you could kind of get some information that were being transferred through like door games and doors and whatnot. But it was kind of like just a whole nother world. Actually, I remember we ran a BBS called Counterculture BBS, which was just like our own BBS node where we could put our games on and hack like Lord. I don't know if you remember playing Lord, Legends of the Red Dragon. It was like the most amazing role-playing game on the BBSs. And so we would do that to like hack our credits so we could continue to play. But I mean, that was probably, that was 80s. And then we had what they called ISDN. It was cool. It was dual ISDN, but it was like two 64K lines. So we kind of skipped the whole dial-up. Yeah, it was super cool. So yeah, just kind of got my start hacking BBSs with some of the backdoors that they were putting in the BBS packages. And there were vulnerabilities that were there where you could kind of exploit sysop access. And so a friend of mine that I grew up with, like we were kind of the nerds, but I skateboarded. And so it was hacking and skateboarding. That's pretty much what I did. And one of my friends that we were doing it with, we'd go to like the local sysop meetings and hang out and like just watch all of these crazy hackers and got it kind of pushed on us. So it was something that we just kind of grew up in, and then moved into like the AOL days, which I kind of skipped the AOL because I had the ISDN line, so we didn't do the whole AOL dial-up, but I was writing Visual Basic progs is what they called them. And so I'd write them for friends and whatnot. So that's kind of where we got started, really. That was probably, and then from there, it's been pretty much offensive security, reverse engineering ever since.
Yeah, it was a lot later for me to get into OffSec. I started making things and then kind of went in that direction. Skyler, what about you?
So I got started in IT in high school, going to our local Votech, where they had a computer repair and networking class, and I actually just kind of fell in with a crowd of tinkerers, and we still had guys in that class that were in their 50s and 60s. I'm just trying to get back into networking stuff, but they were like some of the first computer engineers in the area. And we also had a bunch of young kids that were younger than me getting into it. And so I had kind of a wide array of expertise kind of around me through high school and into college. And I kind of like what Martin had said, like as a kid, I was the guy that was always just taking things apart. I had the obligatory boombox in my room. And when it stopped working, I took it apart, tested cables and power and all that stuff. And I was able to find, fuses just on the, circuitry board that had been blown. And so I went to like Radio Shack and got a set of fuses and put it all together, and it worked just fine. So that kind of wet my whistle, so to speak, on just tinkering and repairing things that were broken and investigations and things like that. And once I got into college, there was a cybersecurity program and they were offering a scholarship, and I was originally going to be a radiology technician just to get in the medical field, but I saw they had a full ride scholarship for new students. I applied, I got the scholarship, and I just kind of stayed in cybersecurity ever since, just based on that community college course.
All right. Well, Mike had mentioned, that maybe with a little bit different geography, he would have been hanging out with Martin and setting up a BBS and some of those things early on. I'm sure everybody is, familiar with some of the granddaddies like DEF CON and some of the BBSs like, Cult of the Dead Cow and stuff like that. And if you're not, of course, you can easily research those things. But what were some of the other early scenes, maybe where you guys were specifically, or things that you participated in personally that were interesting from kind of the beginnings of InfoSec culture, if you will?
Martin,
I'll take this one first. So interestingly, I had a bit of a gap in my, from the early on in computers. Just weren't a lot of computer jobs back then. And so the only job I could get was in live sound. So I missed a lot of the sort of early AOL stuff because I was working in live sound, but I learned a lot about how to adapt gear and things to environments really rapidly. And so that experience really sort of shaped my culture. And then later on, when all the sound went to electronics, I already knew what I was doing. And all the stuff made sense to me. They were starting to do preamps with firmware upgrades and all of that kind of stuff. And so I was traveling around the country. I tell the story all the time. And this is back in the days when internet or when Wi-Fi was very, very new. And they had just started protecting it with WEP. And so we were touring around the country with these bands. And so everybody looked at me to research how to break WEP encryption, because we would go to all these venues and then they wouldn't let us use their internet. Everything was very new. They would say, oh, we have it locked down. You have to pay us or something. And so I ended up doing some research, and I completely stumbled into, this would have been about 2005, the remote exploit crew. Mutz, who was the original creator of Backtrack, was one of the 3 remote exploit folks back then. And they immediately taught me how to IRC. And so my earliest experience sort of with the sort of hacker culture like we know today was, similar to a lot of people learning how to break Wi-Fi, but I actually became very, very good friends with Mutz. That's actually how I met Dave back then. That's how I met a whole lot of people. So my earliest, or not earliest, but my beginning experience was in that sort of culture around remote exploit and Backtrack and stuff. And it was very, very different back then. Everybody would get super excited about the releases. They would stay up all night and download the newest release on Slackware. We didn't have these rolling package updates like you have these days. And it just seemed like it was a tough crowd, but people were, nice but helpful, right? There was a lot of, RTFM and, figure it out yourself and, that kind of thing. And I got to be honest, that, that was really good for me because, I was definitely the kind of person that would take it apart and figure it out myself. I would prefer to spend 8 hours taking it apart and figure it out myself than getting the answer from somebody else. And so I just really remember the sort of camaraderie that we had back then on IRC. I didn't do a lot on the BBS boards, but IRC I was super huge into. And so I have very, very fond memories of back then. I'm still friends in real life with several people that I met on IRC. And so when I think fondly of sort of hacker culture, I think about the IRC communication a lot.
Yeah, that's probably mine as well. I mean, BBSs were more isolated and localized, so like the local side BBSs, I would say, because I wasn't big into like any of the remote nodes where you have to so there was some Wares nodes where you could download certain software, but I already had software because my dad had like Avon boxes slapped full of it. IRC was probably the bread and butter of not just the culture, but really where my roots are at. So yeah, definitely I was really big on FNet. I still kind of am on FNet even today. Undernet for a long time. And then we ran our own IRC for a little while. But yeah, IRC is probably the root of everything. I mean, we had everything from what you're talking about, being XDCC bots, where if you wanted to download stuff, you could download it. There was IRC Wars, where you can kind of put together different scripts. And so, or egg drop bots and kind of, it was just always on. And, do you remember like you'd post a message or just drop something in a channel, and then like people wouldn't respond until their time zone. So you would sit there for a long time, and then finally someone was just idling, and then they'd finally respond. And like nowadays it's so, you need to respond right away, like Discord or Slack or whatever platform you're on. Like you expect an answer almost immediately, where before you could drop something in a channel and not get a response for like a day. It's just a totally different world. But yeah, so like I would say though, my IRC experience wasn't like, I mean, it was friendly, but it was also like very cliquish. So we had groups, obviously, and the groups would meet in channels, and there was wars against groups and takeovers and riding net splits or causing net splits to ride the net splits into the IRC channel. And then so what would happen is these servers would be like interconnected. And so like Martin could run one, I'd run one, and then we would join them into like a network. And so on IRC, when these servers got overloaded, they would split. They would drop connections. And then when they came back, they would reconnect to the other servers. But the problem is like, if we're in the same channel and I'm on one server, Martin's on another, and there's a net split, those two servers would separate. So what you could do is you could basically like ride that net split back into the channel, and then you'd be the only one in there, and you'd be an operator. So whenever the split like merged back, you'd see the server like reconvene the figurations, and so all of the users would be admins, and you could basically like mass de-op and then kick and ban from the channel and like take it over. And so groups were doing that against other groups, and it was straight chaos, but it was so much fun. It's really where I think my development like really took off, because in the early IRC days, you'd have scripts to kind of automate a lot of this. So yeah, IRC, I mean, some super fond memories. I mean, all my stories are probably built around that time with IRC. So
yeah, that's a good point, because I think for me too, that's really true. Like a 14.4 modem and an IRC client was when I first started like interacting with other people, and definitely that was like the first time, you were like exposed to, hey, there's a hacker culture. People aren't just, writing basic programs that do things, and, whatever they were discussing in PC Magazine that week, there was more going on and more out there stuff going on there. Did you guys play with any of the early web chat stuff? Because I remember Angel Fire was always huge, and that one, my friends and I worked out that you could easily hijack accounts because of the way they built session cookies in URL. And I forget exactly how it worked, but I think it base64 encoded your username and it hashed it somehow. But anyway, what you could basically, the easiest way to do it was you'd create another user with the last letter of their name changed, and the same username with the first letter of their name changed, and then mash them together basically.
That's funny.
Take the beginning of one and the other end of the other, substitute it into the URL bar, and suddenly you were that person. And so, I mean, we would just drive people nuts all day long with that in the afternoons after school.
No, I never did anything with Angel Fire. I did ICQ for a little while. Like I had what was like the 5-digit ICQ or the 6-digit ICQ, whatever the original. Like there was a short one that everybody wanted. This ICQ got older, but I didn't really do anything with Angel Fire. I mean, I remember the old angelfire.com / tilde username URLs that people would host stuff on, but I never got to play with. Yeah, I did do. Do you ever do the old ICMP unreachable packets on IRC? So you could send an ICMP unreachable packet to the server and spoof
WinNuke and
WinNuke. Yeah, you would spoof it. It would WinNuke them. You can nuke them off the servers, force disconnections. Yeah, it was a totally different world back then. I mean, I think part of the culture, though, back then was it was hostile. Like everywhere you went, it was hostile. Almost like if you go to undernet on IRC, hostile, downnet, fnet. And you almost had to like know someone in order to, like, if you wanted to go to a certain location peacefully and be a part of that, like that group or that area, you almost needed to have someone that can kind of like bring you in.
Vouch for you. Yeah.
And it was just very cliquish.
Yeah, you 100% had to be kind of vouched in on most of the good IRC channels.
But I mean, I think the whole like culture was kind of cliquish and really kind of remained so for a long time. Do you think it was the kind of advent of the con that changed that?
You mean which changed it so that it's not like that anymore?
Well, so that it got less cliquish, so that it was easier for, somebody who wasn't already in to sort of show up and say, I'm here and I'm interested in things and I have some neat ideas. Because I feel like you can kind of do that today to an extent. I mean, there's still certainly cliquish areas in InfoSec, but I mean, in the early con days, if you weren't one of those people that had a handle that people knew, I mean, you couldn't just you could stand in the back of the room and watch. I mean, that was your role there. Now, I mean, you can walk up and ask questions and most of those things. But was that when the culture began to open up a little bit and get more willing to kind of embrace new people, do you think?
It's certainly a good question. I think that might be, I think part of that is it. I think also the connectivity online changed. There was a lot of, and then just other aspects too, like YouTube and bringing online content. I think the whole evolution of how the internet kind of came together and brought that, I think, made it so that anybody could progress. Historically, in that scene, and like that, they protected it. Obviously, there's a lot of ego and a lot of just whatever that was just negative. But there was also a protectiveness of what people knew and what people had access to that was different. I think cons certainly did expand it to make it a little bit more accessible. Online chats and YouTubes and everything from the internet aspect really brought that, I think, connected it. And so I think, yeah, maybe cons did kind of do that. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how else outside of that it could have done. I remember but even the cons have really changed. I mean, I remember DEF CON, like super old DEF CON, Wolves Among Us. There was a talk, Wolves Among Us, at DEF CON, and it was when Gobbles, there was an underground group that was going after all of like the white hats. So there was a big separation between black hat and white hat. And the black hats back then were targeting the white hats. And so it was a full blown compromised mail servers, dump mail spools in these e-zines and expose, and they had everybody in their targets. A lot of them are actually working and leading like companies now. So it's interesting that where it's at, but DEF CON then, DEF CON now, completely different. It's a completely different conference. The conferences were around then, but even with conferences then, you still kind of had that. I don't know. Like, I think maybe with the B-sides and the big B-sides movements and some of the more streamlined, friendly, accepting conferences, maybe that helped kind of shift it.
Do you think much of it had to do with, say, the commercialization of it too? Because, I do look back at those early days and a lot of that stuff. I mean, you mentioned the protectiveness and, you look at like what CDC was doing in those guys and really just a lot of the stuff people were discussing in general, technically illegal. I mean, almost everything anybody was doing probably violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act back then. And so I think there was probably a reluctance to talk to people you didn't know, and that sort of, as it got industrialized a little bit, did everybody start to relax more?
Yeah, and maybe the stripping of identity. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would totally agree with that, Geoff. I think two things happened. Friendlier cons, kind of like Mike Felch mentioned. Selfishly, I do think DerbyCon sort of pushed the needle in a more sharing, less ego direction. But I also think the commercialization of the service, right? Like now everybody's got jobs they got to protect and clients they got to make happy. And back in the day, like we were just doing it for the curiosity, right? I mean, sure, there were some people that did stuff for monetary gain, but in my opinion, real hackers just did it for fun, and then moved on to something else. But, unfortunately, the natural progression of people is if they find something they love, they, try to find a way to monetize it or do it as a job for the rest of their lives. And we've done that, but, we've turned it much more into an industry. And I would say we're definitely farther away from the hacker culture. Because kind of like Mike was saying, like back in the early DEF CON days, I mean, it was really cliquish. Like if you didn't know anybody, you were just, standing in a sea of people by yourself and, never got invited to anything and that kind of thing. So I do think both of those things, so have really pushed the needle in a more sort of professional direction, but it's made people a bit nicer, not necessarily because that's what we needed, but just by progression of what's happened.
Let's actually explore that just briefly too, because I do think, even now, whenever I go on site and I meet the InfoSec people and stuff versus maybe some of the other business folks, there's definitely kind of a different attitude. I don't know how to put my finger on that exactly, but obviously, Martin, you spend a lot of time doing the solutions architecture work. What would you say to somebody, that's not from the InfoSec world about, interfacing with InfoSec people?
Oh yeah, I have to have that conversation a lot with folks because I oftentimes have to explain that there's a big difference between getting the best person for the job and the person that can explain the job to your management the best. And oftentimes those aren't the same people. And so a lot of times, even at TS, we have, very specialized engagements that, only one person can do. I know several folks on this call have gotten that from me. And a lot of times I have to explain like, hey, this person doesn't like to leave the house, or, this person works only night hours, or, this person is very neurodivergent, please don't make any loud noises. Now I'm embellishing, but things like that, because it really is a certain type of people, that are very, very good at the technical aspects of this job, but it's sort of a different subset of people that are, very, very good at explaining technical things on, more of a sort of layperson's level. And when you find somebody that's good at both, I consider those unicorn hackers.
Yeah, I mean, we're a group of people that tries to put as many stickers as possible in really expensive equipment. So, I mean,
and first thing before you do any work.
right.
You're looking at my laptop right there, aren't you?
The more it costs, the more stickers it needs.
Exactly. I always have like a stack of con stickers everywhere.
That's awesome.
Sitting at my desk ready to go. Waiting for the next laptop case to come in.
Oh, you got to put it straight on the metal. You got to go straight to the metal. Put it on a case. That's cheating. I'm just kidding.
I'm a purist with gear, man.
Fair.
I think about resale value.
So do you think there's different cultures, in the, say, corporate blue team world than in the red team world, than maybe working at a pure consultancy like TrustedSec, or has that kind of normalized and reached some equilibrium?
I can chime in on that one because in probably the last 10 years, I've gone from just basic network security stuff, being a firewall guy, just opening Facebook for salespeople. And I've done code review for development firms and large organizations. I've done forensics work. And then I've done consulting with TrustedSec and a couple of other places. And where I think the worlds align between, let's say, corporate security and consulting security, hacking security, the goal is the same: to effectively protect your client. And your client could either be the organization you work for, or you could work for a firm and have multiple clients. But the goal is the same, information security. Where they're different, I think it's corporate security is a lot more siloed. If you get into XYZ company and they want you to be their internal pen tester, looking at their web apps, looking at their networks, you're kind of siloed into their environment, and not every organization uses the same appliances and uses the same software and hardware, and just the entire ecosystem changes from client to client when you're a consultant. And so I've had some colleagues that have successfully been in corporate security with like one or two companies for decades. Where we kind of gap ourselves a little bit is that they only know what they're shown with that company, and they don't get exposed to anything else. So I think that's kind of the difference.
Yeah, fair enough. I would say on the consultant side, so I have exposure consulting for a number of offensive security firms and then some big tech security companies. And by far, there's a difference between culture kind of across them all. And they all run their version of InfoSec well, but I would say like TrustedSec, not because it's who I'm here, I'm working here, but it absolutely is an amazing culture. I mean, the team here just operates differently. Absolutely operates differently. I've been in the corporate side where it's more corporate brand security, but doing it for the dollar. I think there's other firms, even like TrustedSec, we do it. A lot of the consultants here and some of the other ones, we do it because we love to do it. It's like we really enjoy what we're doing. And so that makes it easy to test. It makes it easy to stay on an engagement for like after hours or to work crazy on an attack path and then not break. And so it's fun. And then it's different where we're hackers or a hacker firm. Everybody's just great at what they do. Bringing that together just really makes a difference. Whereas some companies don't do that. They are doing it just for the dollar. It's all about the marketing. It's all about the messaging. They don't put a lot of emphasis on the technical side. They put a lot of emphasis on the selling side, which is just typical corporate world. Unfortunately, there's even other ones that are out there just for the money grab. So I think it's across the board. I think, and that's also why we see different conferences. I wouldn't say behave differently, but there's different conferences. There's a difference between going from, a technical conference that specializes in new latest technology versus going to a family fun security conference versus going to historically crazy DEF CON that's just wild. It's just different. I think there's different areas and you can pretty much do whatever you want to do still to this day. If you want to go to just pure hacker culture, there's conferences for that. You want to go bring your family to a security conference and have your kids pick locks, like they have conferences for that. You want to go just corporate-y and just stay on the business side, there's conferences for that. So I think it's kind of still pretty versatile when it comes to what's available and what's out there.
I will say, though, that I think some of the cliquish stuff is coming back around, not in the same way, and I wish Elsie was on here to talk about the OST debate, but I think at some point, we overshared, and a lot of people came into the industry in entry level jobs. And 10 years ago, we would have said cybersecurity is not an entry level job. But nowadays, I have seen in the past couple of years a shift back to invite only conferences that are hyper focused on one thing, like offensive security, or hyper focused on the blue team or something like that. And I think that came out of, conferences saying any talk is a hacker talk, mod your coffee maker, all that kind of stuff, which is great. Totally agree. But security professionals go to a security conference for stuff they can use at work tomorrow. Like, that's why I go to a talk. Like, if I can't use it at work tomorrow, like, I'm not super interested in it. I'm very sort of tactical and on the ground. But anyway, I've seen a lot of shift, back to some invite only conferences. So I do think that we're realizing that, perhaps we need to tighten the reins on the folks that are doing the research and sort of spearheading some of the stuff and get our message back together, make sure we're saying some of the same stuff and that kind of thing. So I do think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, I do think that's true too. There was definitely a period of, I don't know, 2018 and beyond there where I feel like a lot of the talks really started drifting into even beyond hacking your coffee maker, but just outright, weird stuff, that was, almost more a social movement than a technical subject. And it's kind of like, is this, why did you come here for this? There are other venues for this. And so I do agree with you. I think it's good to, not gatekeep exactly, maybe make some spaces that are reserved for useful topics that are rather immediately applicable topics, tools, technology. You mentioned OST. I assume that's open source tools, Martin?
Offensive security tools.
So it's okay. Well, okay. See.
Yeah, because it's a bit of the same debate, right? Do we release the tools, or do we have a secret group that only uses the tools? Like, who gets to approve who's in the cool kids club? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And
so go ahead.
I was going to say, you look at stuff like Metasploit and Backtrack, originally, that really democratized, who could do some of this testing work. And that was fine, except that it reduced a lot of it to very procedural type activity that, put it in the hands of people that didn't necessarily have the creativity and the insight. And not necessarily because they couldn't, but because they just didn't yet, and they didn't get there the hard way. And I think it's taken a while to address that correctly.
Yeah, I think also we'll see a repeat if we continue to move into this mode where it's disclose nothing. What we're going to see is a repeat of what happened late 90s, early 2000s when you had that movement where it was like anti.security.is started, and it was basically ADM, who at the time ADM was releasing all of the remote root 0 days that were happening, or they were keeping them private and they would end up getting leaked. So ADM plus security.is created this anti-security movement where there was like, well, we have this policy that we're putting in place. We're going to keep all the bugs private and we're not releasing any exploits anymore. Don't share any details about any of the bugs. And then if there is something that does get out, don't claim someone else's bug. And it was like this kind of core policy that they really started to govern. And a lot of people that were a part of ADM and some of these other early school TESO and some of these other groups were adhering to this. And so it was just this start where exploits were not getting leaked. But we also had sec lists, full disclosure, which was like the mailing list that you could sign up for and get stuff. So what would end up happening inevitably was by trying to keep it quiet, someone would leak it to a friend that wasn't a part of it. That person would use it and weaponize it against X, Y, or Z, and then either burn it, or they would just go to full disclosure and just drop the proof of concept on full disclosure and watch the world burn. And so like that's kind of the whole full disclosure versus the coordinated disclosure, or whatever they want to call it now. And this concept of if you keep it private, it's going to get out there, it's going to cause damage. Nobody has time to be able to use it in their own environment in order to strengthen things back up. But if you do make it available, then people have the opportunity in order to use it in their environment to assess their risk and mitigate whatever they need to mitigate as a proof of concept. And yes, it's still going to be weaponized eventually down the road, but at least you're mitigating a lot of the impact that it could have on environments by doing that. I'm all for siloing conferences for like a red team conference or a blue team conference. I'm all for that. I would prefer to probably go to the offensive ones because, like you were saying, I want to go to learn something that I could actually apply here. But I'm actually starting to change my moral compass on offensive security disclosure. For instance, this is me personally. It's probably not going to be something that people like, but I'm not a big fan of coordinated disclosure anymore. I've tried to work with Microsoft on stuff, and Microsoft would just, they came after me, hit me with DMCA takedowns. Or I disclosed something to Google, and it was, no, we're going to hide this and then shut you down and then block your Google accounts. And I got into a big fight with Google. Over the years, we've mitigated. They've sent like a olive branch, and we've kind of worked through those details. But trying to disclose something to a large organization that has the power to either shut you up or to not do anything about it, and it only impacts the majority of users that are using that service. I used to be all about coordinated disclosure. Now I take it on a case by case. I'll just full disclose. I think full disclosing something and just dropping it out there and letting people leverage it in their own environments. If bad people use it, then they use it. But I do it on a case by case situation just because it's my worldview on what I deem to be the right way to approach this. And I'm not going to allow the culture or the industry or some loud voice that's on Twitter or X, whatever, to say that I shouldn't do something and I'm wrong for doing that. It's my moral compass. I'm going to let that guide me. And so I'm going to take it by case. Sometimes it'll be coordinated. Sometimes it might be full disclosure. Sometimes it might be non-disclosure. I'm sitting on stuff now that I haven't disclosed and I don't plan on disclosing it. I'm just going to continue to use it on my red team engagements until it gets burned, and that's just going to be it.
I 100% agree with you, Mike. I feel the exact same way that every single one of these should just be on a case by case basis. I deal with quite a few of them, at TrustedSec where, a lot of times the guys on the team find bugs in, software we're using, or, on a pen test, there was some random software they looked at. And so the responses that I get from most of the companies are less than stellar and makes me not want to, report them to them. It's so interesting. We started talking about that because I just had one, happen this morning that, didn't really go the way that I wanted it to. Me personally, I was a huge fan of Millworm back in the day because it was a public exploit site. So everybody could get to it. Everybody had access. But people with really good weaponized exploits would change a couple of things in the code, or they would, move a few things around. And then that way you had to at least know something or know somebody, to figure some of this stuff out. And I realize that's not a giant roadblock, but like me personally, I learned more, hacking code things from fixing millworm exploits than I ever did in ever training that I've ever taken anywhere else. And so I am a fan of the of making the exploits public, but raising the bar a little bit to weaponize them in some situations.
It's interesting because, I always found the whole reasonable disclosure process a little bit bothersome, mostly because it was too corporate and, everybody wanted 3 months, notification periods and stuff like that. And it's like, well, listen, guys, I'm not all that smart. I found it. Somebody else could too. And in the meantime, everybody's walking around with their pants down. They just don't know it. And, so I'm with you too on that sort of case by case basis. I always thought that, in many ways, putting that out there on ExploitDB or Millworm or wherever, or sec lists back in the day, was probably the way to go because, put it in front of those eyeballs. At least somebody has the opportunity to mitigate it if they want to. And we all know that unless there is a real proof of concept, you can't just say, trust me, there's cross-site scripting or there's an IDOR here somewhere. Take my word for it. Nobody will do anything about it. You've got to include the proof of concept or it just gets ignored. So, I don't think that's changed. I don't think it will ever change.
Yeah, you brought up Millworm. Did you know prior to millworm.org as an exploit DB site, they used to be one of the groups, one of the old IRC groups?
No, I didn't know
Good
that.
old Stroke. I think Stroke is still around. He's the one that ran Millworm.
Yeah, he's still around from what I hear, I guess.
Yeah, he's still around. He's actually on X too.
Really? Oh, cool.
Yeah. Yep. Good old Millworm.
Well, before we wrap it up, just to some lighter topics, there seems to be, and it's not me, and that's why I'm going to ask about it because I know there are some people in this room who really like the, shall we say, gang style rap and the heavy metal and the things like that to go along with their hacking, and I just can't concentrate with that going on while I'm trying to look at a computer program. But why does that seem to be a trend?
The cyberpunk culture?
Yeah, I would say because that music has a lot of feeling and emotion, you have to be really aggressive to do sort of good metal, and it's also, those are musics of countercultures, right? Angry youth at the establishment, which really embellishes the sort of hacker culture as well. Me personally, I grew up around music and in live sound, and I love music, and I can listen to almost any kind of music while I'm, you know, hacking or coding or whatever the case may be. It just has to have no words. As soon as there's words, then I lose it. But as long as there's no words, so I have entire playlists of, just songs without words to get me through on that. But I definitely think that music is a huge part of counterculture and folks expressing who they are. And so I think that's why music has become really sort of closely tied to the hacking scene.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool. I listen to it with music. Anything that has a beat that gets my tempo going, like I'm totally good. But I would say, like a lot of the old school rap, I don't really listen to much anymore. I mean, there's obvious exceptions, like with Wu-Tang, but the stuff that I've been listening to now is cyberpunk. So Bo Bullock's No Bandwidth. If you haven't jived out, you'll love that, Martin. If you ain't been listening to that, there's no lyrics.
I'm writing it down right now.
Yeah, I introduced Oddvar to that.
Oh, I said I got the jam with Bo a couple years ago at Wild West Hackin' Fest when they do their open mic jam session after the after
That's
the conference.
cool.
One last thing before we go then. Movies. It seems like there are certain movies that get accepted by the hacker community and certain ones that just don't. And I mean...
Swordfish, right?
Yeah, that's a great example. Versus Hackers is accepted, Tron is accepted, but other, techno flicks seem to garner the hate. Is there a discernible pattern that any of you guys have noticed as to, what will play to this community and what won't?
Accuracy.
I actually do have an opinion on that, and it's kind of accuracy because a lot of it's, are there proper commands on the terminal? But for me, it's like antitrust. I could have easily been in that situation. Hackers could have easily been in that situation. Swordfish, not so much, right? Like, I don't really. So for me, it's like accuracy, but like how likely like is that to really happen to, somebody like me?
So did Mr. Robot ultimately jump the shark, or?
Mr. Robot, I got mixed feelings on. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I didn't love it. So the season when he was in jail, I think rubbed me the wrong way, but the rest of it I loved.
Okay.
It was a great show, but the season where he was in jail kind of threw me for a curve, and I don't know, it wasn't quite the same after that. But again, that's something that could happen to any one of us. So like to me, that definitely hits the mark.
Yeah, I'd say the first half of the series of Mr. Robot was like that. That was the attention grabber. That got all the infosec people in. It's like, oh yeah, I know that tool. He's saying all the things that we say if we're doing an investigation, and they were doing all the right things. But yeah, what Martin said, I think they went off the rails with the story toward the end there.
I don't remember where I stopped watching it, but I remember being turned off significantly on one of the episodes, and I was just done.
All right. Well, I do want to thank our guests for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you for listening. Security Noise is a production of TrustedSec LLC. If your organization has any questions or needs any help with information security, go to www.trustedsec.com. And this is our last episode for this season of Security Noise. We're going to take a few much-needed months off, probably, and enjoy some summer vacation. I know Skyler is tired of editing, and
we will be on a boat, man.
We will be back in the fall.
See you guys.